How's it going, and welcome to No Fun Allowed's guide series on the Wild Beyond the Witchlight, a 5th edition module. In today's video, we'll be going over the Palace of Heart's Desire, and of course there is going to be a ton of spoilers. Players do not watch this, but DMs don't want that added insight. Go and stick around because we got a lot to cover here. So here it is, the grand finale. This is the place your players are trying to get to the entire time. They are trying to get to the Palace of Heart's Desire. So the thing is shouldn't players at this point be able to go to the Palace of Heart's Desire? At this point in the game, they're at least level 5, 6, 7. Maybe they have some magical spells that allow them to fly, or they can climb, or do whatever. Well, I mean, yes, technically, but as written, it states that you are basically going to get lost if you try to make your way there, unless you've got a guide. And in which case, there is a guide in the form of Amador the Dandelion, but Amador is only going to help the party once you help out Gleam and Glister. The other way to get to the Palace of Heart's Desire is through activating the bell in Motherhorn and then hopping on a flying crane and making your way over there. Simple as that. Now, of course, I'm sure some groups are going to want to try and skip to the finish line early here, in which case you got to put your foot down or just allow it to happen. Whatever the case may be, once your players arrive to the Palace of Heart's Desire, they're going to discover that this is clearly an homage to old school play with an awesome mega dungeon and a whole bunch of crazy weird things going on. Now it's in this section where we get the full details of what went down with the fall of the Witch Queen, about how she was large and in charge, and then the hags took over, and of course the League of Malevolence stormed in and ruined everything, and the palace is all frozen. And of course, that leads to a whole bunch of fun things inside. Inside, your players are going to be dealing with League of Malevolence characters. They're going to be dealing with a whole bunch of people that have now shown up to the Palace of Heart's Desire. And they're also going to be potentially dealing with the hags, because the hags presumably want to protect the cauldron. And if they learn that the players are going there to destroy the cauldron, they are going to make their way there. Now it's when your players finally arrive to the Palace of Heart's Desire. 1, show them that awesome handout because my goodness, that artwork is fantastic. But 2, as they arrive, they will also spot the Jabberwock as it makes their way inside. This is where you can basically put a stop to all of the followers that your players have. If you're like me and you love giving your players a whole bunch of hireling, henchmen, retainers, followers, whatever, and at this point in the game, they've got at least 10 people following them around because this game is just full of delightful characters, you can finally say, hey, there's a reason why all these, weakling people don't want to show up here. Because they know that this place is dangerous. They know that there's this Jabberwocky. They know that there's these hags running around. They know that there's all these things. So you can finally say, hey, just back to the original characters. But it states here that if you have Elkhorn or Molliver with the party, they definitely want to go in. In which case, yeah, allow it, but what I would strongly suggest is never make a DM PC ever, because that just ruins everything. Make sure that the NPCs are always taking a backstage to the main adventure at hand, which is of course your player's adventure, not the characters. So a major aspect of exploring the Palace of Heart's Desire is, 1, your players are going to figure out that there's a whole bunch of things that are locked in time, and that is both people and objects. The interesting thing about the people is that your players can't interact with them in any way, shape, or form to make them come alive, but they can move them around should they desire. But the thing is that the inanimate objects, your players can manipulate them, and they actually do retain their functionality. Such as the example here is, if your players pick up an apple, they can eat it. But if your players try and move around some person, then that person is just simply locked there and they can't move out of their pose. Another amazing aspect of this castle is the crown locks. So you'll see on the map here, there's a whole bunch of stags and a whole bunch of lions. What that indicates is at any given time, your players could have half of those doors open, because as we'll be getting into in the first portion here, your players could activate only half of them at a time. Once your players explore around the castle enough, they can actually make themselves able to open up any door at any given time. But I like this aspect of this puzzle where your players figure out, okay, there's a whole bunch of doors here and we can't open them. We'll come back to that later once we have the opportunity. Sort of like a Legend of Zelda style dungeon. I really like it. So with the first portion of the castle here, we get the gardens. And it's in these gardens where your players are going to interact with a whole bunch of NPCs that have only just blown into town, essentially. And they are not going to be able to know anything because they only just showed up here. they haven't been allowed inside, and thus they are not going to go inside. But it's in these gardens where your players will get a whole bunch of fun details, and they'll begin to understand the scope of what's going on. They get to interact with all these NPCs. They can see that the water is standing still, but if they interact with the water, then of course they can see that it moves. But most important of all is the fact that they are given the crown, and that crown is going to allow them to go inside. So for that portion here, we have Area 8, the pond. And in the Maiden's Pond, your players will be given the crown, and it states whenever a character holds the crown, a gentle voice in the wind, in a language the character understands, the voice says, the beginning of whenever, the end of ever after, the start of an age, the finale of every moment, and the first in history. This does spell out wrath, but I'm willing to bet if you just say this out loud, nobody's going to pick up on it. It's definitely something that you pretty much have to write down because people are probably not going to understand what it means. But once they do, then they can absolutely figure it out. Once your players finally make their way over to Envy's Tower, that is when they'll interact with Envy, the first of these guardians. Now, hopefully your players don't upset anybody here, because as soon as Envy sees the party, Envy is going to command the party to kneel before them, and if your party does, then hey, this makes life simple, but if your players don't do this, then a combat is probably likely to ensue. Envy doesn't actually know what's going on here. Basically, these guardians are just locked here, and they don't really do too much, but what they do is allow people to go in if you place the crown on their head, and of course your players do not have access to the other one because, just read the map here, your players really only get to Wrath's Tower once they get to Area 15, and that might be a while. Your players may not actually be able to get there for quite some time, depending on how they actually go about exploring the Palace of Heart's Desire. I really like these portions because your players place the crown on and then they can make their way through, but then they start to realize the puzzle of this place and they have to go back and forth. But every time they go, they have to give up something. And, you know, I really like that sort of style of play because it really rewards the people that want to explore around. But if they don't really care about exploring these rooms, then, hey, they actually don't need to, because your players can actually make their way through this adventure, essentially, without having to put the crown on Wrath's head if they desire. But also, if they explore around enough, then they can actually figure out that they don't even need to do the whole crown thing at all. So, I really like it. So natively, there is only one way your players are going to walk their way through here. But of course, there is the possibility that your players decide to fly up or they decide to scale around. In which case, there's going to be a whole bunch of windows they could probably fly on through. There's the Beanstalk, of course. There's a hole all the way at the back of the castle. You know, there's a bunch of ways your players could theoretically try and climb through here. If they do want to do that, that's perfectly fine. But just note that you're going to have to be ready for whatever you have prepared. I would say, though, that the best thing about this Palace of Heart's Desire is you typically don't need to absolutely have absolutely everything memorized, because you can sort of read aloud what's going on and it works. Just make sure that you have everything prepared in regards of how the NPCs are going to interact with them. So as your players explore around, they'll presumably go through Area 11 and then through Area 29. However, it is possible that in Area 11 there, they go through the balcony and they look around and see the court itself. In which case, that's going to be totally awesome. You know, they'll be able to see a whole bunch of fun things, and they'll continue on and on. As they're continuing along, they can interact with some of the named NPCs, but they may theoretically not interact with some of these named NPCs. The big thing to consider is, once they get up to this area here, right in front of Area 28, this is definitely going to be totally up to how your players actually explore around. Because they could go through to the court itself, they could go upstairs, they could go to the main corridor there. There's a lot of different ways. You probably know how your players typically explore around. Are they the kind of group that always goes left? Are they the kind of group that just wings it every time? Are they the kind of group that, you know, just charges in one direction? Who knows? But just note that once they typically get to here, that is when they're going to be exploring all over the place. Some more important things to note here is in Area 30, we have Zargash, one of the members of the League of Malevolence. If your players make their way in here, they're going to see Zargash, but Zargash is actually going to appear as if he is frozen, much like all the other things around here. And it's totally creepy. There's at the bottom of this thing, there's a whole bunch of muck, and if you stay in this muck for too long, you get transformed, and it's actually a PC destroyer kind of curse. If your player gets transformed, then unfortunately they're stuck like that. Zargash does not want to pick a fight with the party because presumably it's just him by himself, and of course all the party. So probably not going to do anything about it. But if for some strange reason only one person shows up here, then maybe Zargash tries to strike up some sort of bargain or maybe attacks. I'm willing to bet that Zargash is the kind of person that would likely to try and lead them into a trap of some sort or make sure that he's in the upper hand. In Area 28, we have Sean. And Sean is a very interesting character. They were actually in this library during the time of the freezing of everybody in here. But because of this library's nature, that it's protected from the outside because it's a little pocket dimension, they were actually saved from all of the freezing. Sean is essentially acting as a page for the League of Malevolence. The League of Malevolence is telling them to basically try and find a way to unstuck everybody, but they're kind of dragging their feet. However, Sean is able to give your party a whole bunch of clues and is actually really awesome. It's in Area 22 where there is a whole bunch of things going on. My goodness, in the book alone, this thing takes up forever. But basically, as your players look inside, they'll see that there's a whole bunch of people all standing around a cauldron, and they're all frozen in time. And presumably, your players may interact with the Jabberwock here. The Jabberwock would be curled up around the cauldron, and your players full well know that this thing is going to be dangerous. If you have a group that sees monster, kill monster, then unfortunately, the combat is probably just going to spark right here. But if your party is one that knows when they are outmatched, then hopefully they try and circumnavigate around, hopefully they try and stealth around, hopefully they do something else. Something to note about this Jabberwock is that it's an incredibly dangerous fight. So what I will say is at this stage in the game, 115 HP is not that much. This thing is a glass cannon. But the thing to consider is that this thing is super scary. It's got its 2 rend attacks, which have a plus 10 to hit, 3d10 plus 5 damage. That's a lot of damage coming out. It's got the fiery gaze, which does 7d8 fire damage. My goodness, that's a DC 18 as well. But the most important thing about this thing that makes it incredibly scary is its confusing burble. Any creature that starts its turn within 30 feet of the Jabberwock and is able to hear its burbling must make a DC 18 charisma saving throw. On a failed saving throw, the creature can't take reactions until the start of its next turn, and it rolls a d4 to determine what it does during its current turn. On a 1 or 2, it does nothing. On a 3, the creature does nothing except use all of its movement to move in a random direction. So presumably you just roll a d8 and you just use the cardinal rules or whatever. And on a 4, the creature either makes 1 melee attack against a random creature it can see or does nothing if no visible creature is within its reach. Very, very disruptive. And the thing to consider is, with most things that have a sort of save like this, usually if you succeed, then you're immune for the next 24 hours. No, that is not the case with this creature. This creature continues to exude this aura. And guess what? If you have a DC 18 charisma saving throw, the grand overwhelming majority of people are going to fail on average. So if you've got a 4 PC party, it's more than likely that 3 are going to fail. And that is just absolutely going to make it so your party is shut down and they cannot do anything. This thing is super scary. But the thing is, people looking at this thing wouldn't know it's scary because it just looks like a goofy little weird dragon thing. So how do you tell your party that this thing is scary? How do you forewarn them that this thing is super scary? Well, you could have NPCs say, oh yeah, I've heard that this thing is able to drive people mad if they overhear it. Maybe NPCs state that this thing, while it looks comical and goofy, is actually stronger than most dragons. You could have a bunch of things like that to try and forewarn them. But if they do not prepare for this fight, then unfortunately they are going to be in for the fight of their lives, and it's mostly going to just come down to them trying to make charisma saving throws, which most people are bad at. Of course, the big way your players are able to win this fight is if they shut down their ability to hear, if they have some sort of ability, or they simply say, hey, can we create some sort of, wax to cover our ears or whatever. If your players are that creative, then props to them. But if they are not that creative, then they are easily going to get dunked on. Over here in Area 20 is one of the ways we're going to be able to save the PCs from the terrible nightmare that is the Jabberwock. If your players are able to release Bloody Beak, the giant owl, from its cage, then Bloody Beak will hunt down the Jabberwock and the Jabberwock will fly away, sending away 2 gargantuan creatures that the party presumably does not want to deal with. So I really like this because it definitely rewards players that explore around a bit and think of more than one way to skin a cat. In Area 18, we have Doob Forgale, who is the giant Fomorian that's just eating up all the food in this place. And the thing to consider is if your party walks in here, the Fomorian's going to shout, "Bring me some cake." And if your players bring the cake, then hopefully they can get out of harm's way for a bit. But if they don't bring that cake, then they're going to be in for a fight with a Fomorian. Pretty bad. But something to remember is the Cyclops is looking for love. And if your players mention some way, somehow, that, hey, do for Gale, we know someone that would love to meet you, then you can have a totally fun moment where the Cyclops comes in from the gardens, let's say, and do for Gale and the Cyclops meet, and then they can have a little date or whatever in the gardens. That would be totally cute, totally fun, and a totally great way to get a whole bunch of nasty monsters out of the party's way. In Area 15, we have the Servants' Quarters, and it's here where if your players look around enough, or they've been informed by one of the other NPCs around here that Thinnings is still around, your players can find Thinnings. And Thinnings is going to be able to spill the beans about a lot of good things. And these things are very important, because if your players don't know these things, then they may not be able to save the day. Thinnings is able to tell the party about what's going on, about who Zybilna's true nature is, and it can tell all about what's going on and maybe help basically try to explain about what's going on in the castle and how to better navigate it. Now, the important thing to remember though is that Thinnings is obviously skeptical of the party, so if the party just shows up and doesn't do anything in particular, then Thinnings probably isn't going to share too much. But if the party is able to convince Thinnings that they are on the side of good, or if they're trying to save Zybilna or do whatever, or if they're against the League of Malevolence, then for sure Thinnings will definitely help out the party and give some really good details about Zybilna, about Bloody Beak, about the League of Malevolence, about all these people. Something very important and actually really cool to note is, at any given time, if your players are looking in the court here and they can see that if you fall into this thing, you're totally going to die. But more importantly is the fact that they're going to see Strongheart, the leader of Valor's Call, floating in the air next to a whole bunch of debris. Your players will be able to easily note that Strongheart was hit by something. But most important of all is, they know that if they return the world to normal, then Strongheart's going to just fall into the storm and totally die. So your party hopefully comes up with some solution to get them to safety. I presume most groups are just going to make a lasso and tie him in and then bring him in. Easy peasy. But, you know, maybe some groups kind of forget this whole thing and leads to a catastrophic failure. Also on this floor, we have Ringle Run. And the interesting thing about this one is, as your players look in this area with Ringle Run, they'll see that he was actually casting a Cone of Cold, and the spell is actually beginning to take form. So the important thing to consider here is, if your players are dumb enough to be standing right in front of this thing when they bring Ringle Run to life using the horn, then they're going to be hit by a Cone of Cold. Hopefully they try and maybe turn Ringle Run around, or maybe they just stand out of the way. You know, hopefully they don't stand in the way of this Cone of Cold. But that is very interesting there. Now the real juicy bits here is Area 31, where our players can meet up with Kellic and Warduke. Kellic is the leader of the League of Malevolence, and Warduke is just this mercenary who pals around with them. And it's here where presumably your players can get a final confrontation with the League of Malevolence. Mind you, it doesn't have to be a physical confrontation, it could just be a showdown. The important thing to consider is, if your players have been picking up on what's going on with all these NPCs, they may have heard that Warduke isn't actually tied to the League of Malevolence. Warduke is purely in it for the gold. And if your players, in fact, are willing to bribe Warduke, they can have Warduke work against the League, in which case the League's totally going to give up because they know that Warduke is really strong. Also, something very important to remember is the fact that Zargash could be here as well. If your players didn't deal with Zargash all the way back in Chapter 3, back in Thither, then Zargash could be floating around here. And Zargash is also not loyal to Kellic. No one's loyal to anyone in this crew. It's not a very good crew, in all honesty. What I will say though is, if a combat does break out here, it is actually a pretty dope combat, because Kellic is this, you know, castery type, and then you've got all the cockatrices that are clearly a present threat, because if anybody gets petrified, that's a big deal. And there's also the glassware golems that bust out and fight too. It's actually a pretty dynamic encounter, so I really dig it. What I'll say about the second floor, about the Palace of Heart's Desire, is it's less about the roleplay. It is a lot more about the exploration and world building of this area, because it's on the second floor where your players can get a lot of juicy details about Zybilna, or Natasha, or about whatever version of Tasha that there is around here. So should your players come up to the second floor, they'll learn a lot of juicy details, and it's hopefully here on the second floor where they learn Zybilna's true nature, about how the fact that she is, of course, the famous Tasha, and they can learn the true name, and once they get that unicorn's horn, they can place it upon her and resurrect her and save the day. Once again, what I'll say about running a lot of these locations is you can pretty much just read it, and it just runs right off the page pretty freaking well. The thing to consider, though, is, of course, if the hags are still alive at this portion of the adventure, then they will be chilling around here because they are getting ready to do whatever, right? They don't want the party to ruin their plans. They don't want the party to do whatever. But presumably, if your players have gotten all this way here, then they at least hopefully know at least one of the hag's weaknesses, if not all three. Of course, if they come together as a coven, they are incredibly dangerous. But if the party uses the hag's weaknesses to their advantage, they can easily overcome it. They could create some sort of optical illusion of an eclipse. They could run Widdershins around. Of course, Granny Nightshades is a little bit less easy to exploit if they come around here. But even still, if they knock out two of them with a weakness, then they should be good to go, right? Thing to consider is your party is at least level 7 when they arrive here, so at that stage in the game, they're actually pretty freaking strong, and presumably they picked up a lot of decent magical items along the way. Which, by the way, place is just jam-packed full of magical items, so props for your players that explore around and find a whole bunch of goodies. Now, it's in the central tower on the 3rd floor where your players will be able to find the black book, and if they write their names along in the book, then they can make their way anywhere around here. And what's really cool is if your players flip through the thing, then they can see at the very end, there is all the members of the League of Malevolence, which makes sense, but they can also find a whole bunch of other names dotted around here as well. You may want to stock up on a whole bunch of other names, just in case if your players are nerds and ask about that kind of stuff, but you typically don't need to. You can just say, oh yeah, there's just a whole bunch of people that you don't recognize. Now, one of the most devastating items to be found in this entire campaign is found in Area 50, Snickersnack. The greatsword is, in fact, a beautiful, I mean, just look at this art here. Just an absolutely beautiful piece of jewelry there. My goodness, that's awesome. It is a +3 Vorpal blade, but in addition to it being a Vorpal blade, it also, in fact, has sentience. What's also very strong about this weapon is while attuned to this weapon, you can use your charisma modifier instead of your strength modifier for attack and damage rolls made with the weapon. Incredibly strong. And also this thing has the sentience, and what's really funny about this weapon is the sentience actually has a detrimental side to it, in that it ends its attunement to you if you miss on attack rolls with the weapon 3 times in a row. Each time you finish a long rest after that happens, you can attempt to regain the sword's trust by making a contested charisma check against Snickersnack. I really like that because this blade is basically trying to be chivalric and heroic and awesome, and if you let it down, then it's obviously your fault and Snickersnack doesn't want anything to do with you. Really, really cool. So this thing is incredibly powerful because not only is it +3, it's a Vorpal weapon. On a natural 20, you automatically decapitate something. If you deem it's too big to be decapitated, it does a measly extra 68 points of slashing damage. By the way, the important thing to consider is the weapon ignores resistance to slashing damage. So, but it was already +3 magical weapon anyway, so I guess that didn't really matter. But my gosh, is this thing just so gosh darn crazy good. This is easily one of the ways your players can get the drop on that nasty little Jabberwock if they want to fight it, but hopefully it doesn't come down to blows with that thing. In Area 51, the Beanstalk Tower, your players can interact with a Quasit named Igric, who is actually Igwilv's longtime companion. Your players can get a lot of juicy details from this little creature as well. They can learn all about the vault, and they can learn about the cauldron, and they can learn about the flame tongue. And by the way, the flame tongue is, of course, owned by Warduke. They can learn a bunch of great things, and of course they can get themselves a pair of winged boots, and winged boots are incredibly deadly. And if the unicorn horn is here, then it's here. So there is a lot of areas your players can learn all of the information that they need, which does mean that if your players are trying to 100% this location, then unfortunately there is going to be a bit of redundancy. What I would strongly suggest is if your players are 100%ing this place and interacting with every named NPC and you're tired of giving out the same bullet points over and over again, either you just say that they have nothing else more useful to say, or maybe you come up with some fun other things to say. Maybe you give out some contradictory things to say and make your players guess about Tasha's true nature, or maybe the League of Malevolence's true nature here, or whatever. There's a lot of ways you can approach that. So overall, this is not a traditional mega dungeon in the sense that you are going from room to room slaying every which creature, because hopefully this isn't a absolutely slay everything kind of campaign. But even still, the combats to be had in this area are actually fan-freaking-tastic. If you players have combat with the League of Malevolence in their respective areas, and they get into fights in every which way, then it's actually a pretty fun time still. No matter how you're running this adventure, whether this be full roleplay, a whole bunch of combat, a mix between, whatever way you do it, there's a good mix. Just note that the fight specifically in Area 31 there will be one of the tougher ones. Obviously not next to the Jabberwock, of course. But if your players get into a fight with Kellic and Warduke and all the cockatrices and the glassware golems, that's actually pretty scary if they are not prepared for it. But if they are prepared for it, then it's actually pretty manageable, because Kellic is only got 45 HP, and at level 7, your party can do 45 damage to a single person in a less than a round, so that's actually no issue there. But just note that if fights are going down, then loud noises are being heard, maybe other people hear it, maybe the forces combine and try and team up against the party, maybe the hags over here and try and join in on the fray, maybe your players have to run away from this location, maybe your players have to lock themselves away in one portion of this dungeon and try and seal it off from other outside entities. Your players can be approaching this a lot of different ways, but at this stage in the game, you know how your players operate, so that shouldn't be that much of an issue. As mentioned before, you can definitely run this pretty simply. What I would strongly suggest is you just read through every little location just real quick, like just one time. You actually don't need to read into it too much, but there is just an absolute abundance of fun things to be had here, and I promise you, your players are probably going to take their time with it. Even if they don't 100% this place, it's still going to take a decent amount of time exploring all these places, because they're going to get infatuated with all the things going on. They're probably going to want to talk to all the NPCs they interact with. They're probably going to want to explore all the rooms that they explore in. And they're going to uncover a whole bunch of fun goodies and debate about who gets what. And of course, most important of all is they're going to try and figure out who are they going to turn back to normal? And most important of all is, are they going to be able to free Zybilna from the grasp of this freezing time? So I'm going to be going into ending the campaign in the next video here. But something to note is, your players may think themselves, okay, Zybilna is the queen around here. We're just going to walk up and touch the unicorn horn to her, say Zybilna's name aloud, and save her. But of course, if they do that, nothing's going to happen. And then they're going to finally understand that that's not her true name. And that's definitely going to prompt them to explore around and interact with more of the NPCs, because then they're definitely going to know that she has something going on. On the second floor, though, on that second floor, for sure, they're definitely going to see all of the physical images of her. They're going to see the past, present, future self of her. They're going to see parts of her true name. They're going to see all of those things. And that's what I love about this location, is it's got just excellent dichotomy of exploration, roleplay, and combat. This mega dungeon is absolutely fantastic, and I absolutely love it. So go ahead and tell me, how are your players approaching the Palace of Heart's Desire? Are they coming in here swords blazing, or are they coming in here all diplomatic like? How are the hags in your campaign? Are they all dead? Are they all alive? Is there some dead, some alive? What's going on here? How many people are showing up to the Palace of Heart's Desire? And how are your players going to deal with that Jabberwock? Are they going to try and lure it around? Are they going to be stealthy around it? Are they going to try and immediately free Bloody Beak? Are they going to try and just straight up get into a nasty combat with it? How do you think your players are going to interact with that thing? Because the League of Malevolence is scary, but that Jabberwock, oh my goodness, that thing destroys most groups. So go ahead and tell me all those things, because I would love to hear it, but that's going to do it from me. Thank you for watching, thanks for listening, and thank you to my amazing patrons. You guys are absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.